What's up, guys? In today's video we are tearing apart this destroyed VQ, and I'm answering all of your guys' questions. A few days ago I posted for you guys to ask me a bunch of questions now that we're at the end of the season about competing in Pro-Am, running drift roulette, pretty much anything. And you guys gave me a bunch of really good questions, and I figured why not answer them all while we're tearing this thing apart. So I'm gonna get the camera set up and let's get into it. First off, thank you guys for all the questions on Instagram. Got some pretty funny ones and some really good ones that actually got me thinking. But first question I'm going to tackle comes from Brian, and he asked, how much horsepower were you making and was it enough for hot pit? Answering the second question first, no, it was not enough for hot pit. As far as power goes, this thing made about 270 without nitrous and about 330 on nitrous, give or take. Definitely sub 350, I'll put it that way. I think the tune was a little conservative, and the whole time we were on pump gas. I think if we had switched to E85, we would have made a bit more power. Also, for anyone not aware, I was running a 75 shot for the whole season. I feel that the motor did really well on a 75 shot, and really didn't have any problems, obviously, except for the hole in the block. But I don't know if that's the nitrous's fault, the tune's fault, or the fact that this motor has an unknown amount of miles and it came from someone's backyard. The fact that it lasted this long is really impressive. If you guys never saw like the first couple videos of when I got my Z, you'll know the full backstory on this engine, or rather the lack of backstory. But to summarize the answer to that question, we made about 330, 340. No, it was not enough for hot pit. I think the average car in that series had between 450 and 550. A couple guys were sub 400, honestly like two. I think it was me and one other guy. And some guys had, 800. Alex in his crazy orange Mustang has like 1200 if his boost is turned up. Granted, his car never runs, so I don't know if we really want to count that. But the car and horsepower range is really wide in hot pit. But 350, definitely not enough. I think you realistically need four plus to even remotely be competitive. The next motor package that's going in the Z, I'm going to shoot for 450. And if that's not enough, we'll just throw some nitrous at it, since now I'm kind of familiar with how that all works. Also, it should be said, Hot Pit is talking about putting a minimum requirement horsepower, meaning cars like mine with sub 400 may not even be eligible to compete anymore, which would be interesting. And I do understand why they want to do that. That's nothing that's confirmed. Don't let me speak on behalf of Hot Pit, but it's a rumor that was going around. Next question comes from Xylus, or John. This is John Burrito. LS win. Let me show you guys something. Check this out. This was supposed to be in a later video, and it still will be, but what is that? All right, next question comes from Insta Brandon. He said, what angle kit are you running? Have you ran anything else? And what was your favorite? I run the Super Lock kit from GK Tech. I have their lower control arms as well as their bolt-on like angle kit. Those two parts work together. Now, while I will say GK Tech is a partner of my program, I started drifting with just their bolt-on angle kit. So I was running the little knuckle adapter they sell. I think it's like 200 bucks, 300 bucks with stock lower control arms. Now I ran that for about 2 years. And one of the big reasons I like that kit so much is because it uses so many stock parts that it's really easy to fix when things go wrong. So I ran that the whole time I was on Drift Week. When I used to street drive my car a lot more often, that kind of thing made sense, because AutoZone's not going to have a WiseFab lower control arm, but they are going to have a stock 350Z lower control arm. So if you go flying off track and break something and you need to get home, I like the idea of stock parts. I also really like the GK Tech knuckle adapter because it keeps the car feeling pretty stock, pretty natural. Even with the lower control arms and a lot more angle, the car still is pretty easy to drive. It self-steers pretty well. There's enough adjustments that you can totally change that. I don't have a ton of experience with other angle kits. I've done a few laps in some cars with the Part Shop Max angle kits. I haven't had the chance to drive a WiseFab car yet. Based off my experience with the GK Tech stuff, I'm really happy with it. My car's seen some decent crashes, a lot of off-track excursions, and nothing's ever bent, nothing's come out of spec. I check the alignment before every track day, and it's pretty much solid. Like, it doesn't really move, nothing gets loose. So I like that. I like the serviceability of it all. You can adjust pretty much everything on the car. Is it the best out there? I don't know. Like I said, I haven't driven anything else, but my personal experience, I really like the GK Tech Super Lock kit, and I think it's a good deal for what it costs. It's not crazy expensive like WiseFab. It's not cheap, but you get a lot of bang for your buck. And if your car is not a full track car, you still street it, I think the really cheap bolt-on knuckle adapter is great. Like I said, I ran that for a long time. So I would start there. If you have a pretty basic car and you want to get into drifting, that's always my go-to recommendation. Chev Boy asked 2 questions, actually. One was regarding the GK Tech lower super lock kit. Hopefully I answered that in the other person's question about my angle kit. Then he asked a few more questions. Power with nitrous, like I said, about 340. Is it worth getting a tune? Yes. My car made so much more power after getting a tune. The tuner seemed to believe it had something to do with my ECU. Because my car was originally automatic, he thinks the auto ECU was kind of like keeping everything lower than it should have been, if that makes sense. I mean, when we first unloaded the car off the trailer, it made 210 horsepower or something crazy. It may have even been lower, I don't remember, but it was so bad. The tuner was like, what is going on? There has to be something wrong here. Checked everything, there was nothing wrong. So we literally picked up like 50 or 60 horsepower just off the tune. Not saying that's going to happen to everybody, but if you have an auto car that you manual swapped, you may want to look into it. And the third part of this question says alignment specs. Now this is a loaded question because I firmly believe that there's no right answer when it comes to alignment specs. It really depends on driver preference, the track you're on, what your goals are with your car, with your driving for the day. There's a lot of variables that go into how I set up a car, and I've never done a setup and just left it. I shouldn't say never, I did that years ago. And I did it more so when the car was pretty basic, like in the initial stages of me drifting with this Z. With the basic rule of thumb, I would say you want your rear alignment pretty neutral, right? No camber, just so you get good tire wear. Not much toe in, maybe just a little bit. Again, that depends on your power level and what track you're on and how fast you're trying to go and wheel speed. There's a lot of variables, so we're not going to get into that one. For the front, I like a little bit of toe out. Again, it depends on the track. Some tracks I'll run very little toe out. Some tracks I'll run up to like a ½ inch of toe out, which is excessive. Some front camber, casters, kind of driver preference. How much self-steer do you want? Yeah, that's a tough question to answer in a general sense because there's so many variables. Another question about the GK Tech lowers. That's funny. Hopefully I've answered that by now. Like I said, I'm a big fan. I really like them. They've held up great. And I have no plans of switching anytime soon. Next question is a picture of a cat. Thanks, Carson. Here's a question from Nate. He's who sold me the motor. Shout out to Nate Toes. He said, top 5 mods that all 350Z owners must have for drifting, less common. It's going to be kind of hard to narrow it down to 5 while keeping it less common, but mistakes I see people make with 350Zs, G35s, VQ cars in general. They have problems with the motor, getting rod knock, oil starvation, whatever. It can all be fixed if you run a little extra oil in your motor. I usually run about a quart over, and you run thicker oil. Whatever the factory handbook manual thing says, throw it out and run thicker oil. I ran 1040 or 2050 in my VQ all the time. And aside from the hole in the block here, I mean, it lasted 3 years of abuse, tons of street miles, tons of drift events. I'm talking like 40 plus events. Who knows how many miles this thing had before I got it. Overfill your oil, run thicker and like decent quality oil, change it often. And the other thing that kills these is heat. So make sure you are not overheating. Now, I never ran an oil cooler, never had any issues. I wouldn't recommend that, run an oil cooler. Don't be me. But I had my factory radiator fans hooked up on a switch so that I can keep them on all the time and keep them on high speed. I also deleted the thermostat. I've never had a thermostat in this motor. It did make it run cold on drift week when I was like driving through Utah and northern Nevada and it was snowing. I had to like block off the radiator with cardboard. But aside from that, I've never had any problems. Again, I live in California. It's like super nice out here and we're in the middle of December. But the thermostats are problematic. They are known to get stuck, especially if they're old. So do whatever you can to avoid overheating. I would also really, really suggest hood vents in your car or buying a vented hood. I run like $15 eBay universal hood vents on my hood. They look super cool and they do a great job at getting heat out of the engine bay, especially with my fans wired to run off a switch. I can just flip the switch, have the fans on, and you can literally see heat coming out of the hood vents. That made a noticeable difference. I went from not being able to do more than 2 or 3 laps because the car would get hot to just being able to hot lap all day long as the fans were on and I had those vents in my hood and no thermostat. Okay, let's get to the good stuff. We're gonna get this lower oil pan off and try not to make a huge mess on the driveway here. And with that, I've got a question from Peter. First off, shout out to Peter. He helped so much over the season of Drift Roulette. If you drove the series, you probably saw him at the start line, waving you off into battle. Everyone give Peter a round of applause. But his question says, where have you grown the most? This is a really good question, and it kind of causes me to think, which is dangerous. I think really I've grown the most in the way that I handle stress in competition specifically. There are a lot of other aspects that I feel I have grown in, and that was one of the big reasons that I wanted to get into higher level competitive drifting, was to just push myself out of my comfort zone. Because if you've ever competed in anything, really, it's not a comfortable place to be, especially not in the early stages of a competitive journey. I mean, I remember the first round of hot pit, started pouring rain right before my battle. My competitor, someone told me he wasn't going to make it to the line. He had missed like most of practice that day. And I was sitting there wondering, like, am I going to get a bye run? Am I not? I don't know. I haven't done that many laps in the rain because a lot of our practice was in the dry. I was just kind of in my head about the whole thing. When it was time for me to line up for battle, my car wouldn't start. This was before Optima was part of the team. Thanks, Optima. Car starts every time now. So we had to push start the car. That's enough to stress you out when your car doesn't start and it's time to get on the line. And as we get the car started, I see my competitor roll out last minute, pulling up to the line. Okay, now I've got to get myself into this mental headspace of competing, and I wasn't able to do it, and I drove pretty poorly. Still managed to finish the lap, still did what I could, but it was not good, not my best lap by far. After that day, I swore, okay, I'm going to grow mentally and have the ability to lock into a competitive state regardless of what's going on. And that's something I feel I've really grown in over the course of this year, is regardless of what stressors are happening at an event or whatever the case may be, when I pull up to the line, tighten down my harnesses, I think, okay, it's go time. I'm going to lock in and I'm going to forget about everything else. And I still don't have it mastered. I still let things affect me here and there, but it's so much less now than it was in the early stages of competition. I don't want to stay on this topic for a super long time, but I will say something that really helped me get to this point was competing outside of drifting, doing sports things competitively. Not at a high level, obviously. I'm not an athlete by any means, but just joining in like a fun league of whatever you're interested in. I don't, whatever it could be, something to get some competitive experience in a different environment, so that regardless of your environment, you have the ability to switch gears mentally and lock into a competitive state. And I think that's a really cool skill and something you absolutely need if you're planning to compete at really any level, but especially higher levels in something as demanding as drifting. Okay, let's get back to tearing this apart. That was a good question. What do you guys think? It's not that bad, right? It's not too much metal. How about in here? Nate, my crew chief, asks, why are you gay?
Why are you gay?
Who says I'm gay?
Moving on. Brian's back. He said, not a question. Just want to thank you for running a series for the drivers and not for the money. To that I say thank you for being a driver in our series. For those that don't know, Drift Roulette started because I was denied into hot pit. I really wanted to drive. I thought, I've got some experience, got a lot of seat time, done a lot of events. And they said, no. All the seat time in the world and no competition experience. Who do you think you are? Which is totally fair. That was in 2023. Obviously, 2024, I drove hot pit. But that was the reason Drift Roulette came to be, was because I was told, no, you need competition experience. And when I asked, cool, where can I get competition experience? I wasn't given an answer. There's no series out there that is really at a grassroots level. There is now, we've got us. Flavor Express is doing their thing. Ultimate Drift Challenge came along. So things have popped up, but initially there was nothing. And now there's a clear-cut way to get from a grassroots driver all the way up to FD. Now you can compete in our series Drift Roulette, work your way into hot pit, compete in hot pit, and then work your way into FD. Now there's a system to it all, which is how it should be. There's a lot of feeder series in other states that feed into their Pro-Am series. And I really just felt like we were lacking, and now we're not. I'm super pumped on what Drift Roulette's become and the opportunity it's given a lot of drivers. So if you want to get into competitive driving, make sure to follow Drift Roulette on Instagram. We will be posting next year's competition dates pretty soon here. Also, there's extra holes in here. Hole in the bottom of the oil pan. Obviously the big hole we all saw, and there's a hole in the block and a crack in the block. Pretty cool stuff. Did some serious damage. I'm hoping I'm going to be able to get this upper oil pan off without pulling this, because I cannot get this crank pulley off. Pretty straightforward question here. Are you running a swirl pot? No, I've never ran one. I understand the benefits of it, but I don't think you need it. If you bleed your coolant system right, I would recommend replacing your hoses, deleting your thermostat, and getting one of those bleeder screws that are aluminum, not the factory plastic one. Throw that thing away, and it makes the job a whole lot easier. Tico Z said, love the videos. My question is, what parts break or wear out the most at the track? Good question. Depends on the car. So I can only speak on behalf of a 350Z. Obviously, that's what I have experience with. And honestly, not much. If you maintain your stuff. Now, Zs have a lot of coolant hoses. They have a pretty complex cooling system, at least complex for an older Nissan. I think it's really important that you replace all of those. Like I said, delete the thermostat. I've seen a few of those fail at the track. Just throw it away. I always bring extra tie rods with me, because if you're trying to tandem, get close to people, you can bend a tie rod pretty easily, inner tie rod that is. Another weak point on 350Zs are the steering rack. If you run offset rack spacers, I don't recommend offset rack spacers because they put so much load on your steering rack. I've seen people destroy their steering rack at the track and have to replace it, and that is a terrible job. So do yourself a favor and set your suspension up in a way that you don't need an offset spacer. Or if you want a huge angle kit, just spend the money and modify your subframe and move the rack. Aside from that, these things are pretty much tanks. There's not a lot that goes wrong as long as you stay up on regular maintenance. Do your oil changes, overfill your oil, put the right oil in it, don't overheat it, and they're tanks. I mean, to put it into perspective, when I did Drift Week, we did 9 or 10 track days. I think I did 3,000 plus miles, and I didn't fix anything aside from stuff that I broke. Like I broke a wheel flying off track. That was my fault. Other than that, the car did great. They are really stout little cars as long as you're up on the maintenance. I mean, I went through every nut and bolt before Drift Week, and I think that's why the car held up so well. Here is the moment we've all been waiting for. I finally got this upper oil pan off. You can see our nice little window here, and I believe there's going to be some lovely surprises in here with that. Like the top of my piston. Oop, there's more. Boy, we really did a number on this thing. That's crazy. Is part of the piston. Another piece of the piston. The other half of my connecting rod. See, the bearing was okay. Oh my gosh, look at the rod bolt. Or where it goes through. That's crazy. More pieces of the piston. Wow. A retaining clip for the wrist pin. That's hilarious. That shows you just how exploded everything was. Check out the crank. Oh my goodness. We blew this apart. That's nuts. This is, I forget what the name of this thing is, but the fact that that is just a big hole now. Yeah, we did some damage. There's so many little bits and pieces in here. It's nuts. Oh, we grenaded 2 pistons, not just one. So one of the connecting rods is still connected to the crank, but there's, if you can hear that rattling, it's because there is no piston attached to the top of it. So cylinders 5 and 6 are no longer. Everything else is fine. So we just have a 4-cylinder VQ now, first of its kind. Now check that out. That is some damage right there. So like I said, you can see this connecting rod is just spinning back and forth because there's no piston in there. I was able to turn the motor over now that there's not a bunch of metal in here. You can get a better look at that. So took the piston completely off the wrist pin. How does that happen? Look at the rod too. Oh my goodness. Okay, I'm going to keep that one tacoed rod once I'm able to pull it out. I don't have the right tool for the rod bolts. But all the other bits and pieces that are coming out of this motor, at least the ones worth keeping, like a chunk of piston, I'm going to run a sale on my website for the rest of the month. Just use code RIPVQ. You'll get 10% off anything you order. And until I run out of pieces, I will be throwing in chunks of piston, rod, whatever else in with your order. Not sure why you'd want that, but I think it's a fun idea. Here's a good question from Dan. If I was to start hot pit all over again, would I still drive a 350Z? Now, I can't really answer this with a yes or no answer because the reason I got a 350Z to begin with was because of how good of a seat time car they are. And I wanted to get as much seat time as possible, as quickly as possible, so that I could compete in something like hot pit. And the Z allowed me to do that. Like I said earlier, before I got into hot pit, I probably did 30 events in the span of a year and a half, 2 years. It's a lot of driving. And the Z did it all. Like I said, we street drove it between drift week and street driving it, and I daily drove it for a month or two. Countless track days. It would have been hard to do that in anything else, really. And yes, there are cars that are just as reliable. I probably could have got a Corvette or a newer Mustang and had just as much opportunity for seat time. Those two options, as an example, are way more expensive. So I wouldn't have been able to afford all the seat time too, because that plays a big part in it. Is you may have a car that's really reliable, but if it's really expensive to run because it blows through tires in 3 or 4 laps, or it uses a ton of fuel, or it costs a lot in maintenance. These are all things you have to think about when you want a car that you're going to drive a lot. Now, to get back to the question, if I had to start all over again, I probably would spend a little extra money and get a 370Z and do the same setup that I did. 370 on nitrous, because realistically, that could make about 100 horsepower more than what I had in my yellow Z. And that would have been so much more competitive. Before I bought my car, I was looking for a salvage title 370 or a 350 with an HR that probably would have made like 40 or 50 more horsepower than what I have. And the right deal just never came up. The car I ended up with was the right deal, the right place, the right time. And I don't regret any of that. But to answer the question, if I had to restart, I would probably get a 370 just for the extra power and because I know it would cost about the same to run. Biggest lesson I've learned in competing and in hosting my own drift competitions, if I had to pick one thing that applies to them both, and this is a lesson you can apply to pretty much anything in life, but it's that just about everything you want is on the other side of whatever you're afraid of. In life, as humans, we get held up by fear, stuff that we're afraid of. And even if you don't recognize it as a literal fear, you still get held back because you think, well, I don't want to fail. I don't want to look bad. I don't want to make a fool of myself. I'm not ready. And all of those thoughts came to my head before we started Drift Roulette, before I got into hot pit. Even at the events, those thoughts still come in. Man, do I really belong here? Should I really be doing this? And when you can learn to just acknowledge that those thoughts exist and then step through them into whatever the next step is, the growth becomes exponential because you're stepping outside of your comfort zone. And that's where growth happens. So if I had to put it down to one single lesson between the two, I would definitely say that it's okay to be afraid. It's not okay to let that hold you back. And honestly, if you are looking at something that seems scary, it's probably the right thing to do. I still remember when I was given the opportunity to drive hot pit, I asked Jeff Jones, the guy who runs it, big pro FD driver. I said, Jeff, I don't know that I'm ready. My car's not competitive enough. I don't have the power I wanted. My plan was to get competition experience in 2024, swap the Z, make a lot more power, and then compete in 2025. And he said, you can do that, but if I was you, I'd strike while the iron's hot, get in while you can, and take the opportunity. And I said, yeah, you're right. I would be foolish to turn down an opportunity because even if I lose every single battle, which I did, I still learned an immense amount. And that growth wouldn't have existed if I didn't just step past the fear that going into that brought. That was a really, really good question. Sorry if I got a little deep and philosophical here, but I feel like that's a good note to end on. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. It was a little bit different than something we do, but I wanted to tear this motor down, and I thought it would be fun to get some questions from you guys. So let me know what you thought. As you saw in the little teaser, we've got something big coming for the Z, and I can't wait to share it with you guys, but I've got some more work to do before that. And I've got to update you on this thing. This crashed car is still kicking around. Still got work to do on this too. So lots of updates to come. Make sure you're subscribed. Give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. And as always, catch you in the next one.